Thank you very much, Joao, for this introduction. Thank you again to the organizers to have me here. So in this talk, I will try to resume a little bit what is our work at my institute on island power systems. Some of you might know, I guess all of you, that in Spain there are a couple of island power systems, geographic island power system. They have particular problems, so I will try to shed some light on what are these problems and what can be done. Of course, in 30 minutes I cannot talk about all the things with you, but I'm happy to answer further questions later if you're interested in. So let me start this presentation with just the introduction on, let's say, what are the challenges of island power systems. Where are they coming from, and then we will see how they can be solved. So basically the challenges, there have two natures. There's an economic challenges, there are technical challenges, so we'll see them both in a separated way. Also in reality there is a clear connection between both of them. And the connection that's somehow, let's say, the focus of all these presentations are the spinning reserves. Spinning reserves affect the economics, spinning reserve affect the technical operation, the whole stability of your system. So to give you a short introduction on island power system and on the Spanish ones in particular, well, there are several thousands on the world. I did not study several thousands. I'm familiar with several dozens of them. It's not a problem which has an isolated character. It's very distributed, it's there, and it can be solved. What are the big differences between the islanded systems and the interconnected ones? Well, there are ones of economic natures, ones of technical natures. For example, which is very clear, one difference is you don't have neighbors. So if you don't have neighbors, you don't have support from your neighbors. In any case, not in the case of the disturbance, not in the case of economy of scales. So the economy of scales is quite an important part in the operation or in the planning of a power system. So you see here a graph on costs of combined cycle power plants, and you see how they increase with reduced power capacity. So in a large system where you have support, you can build larger power plants, which makes very much sense. In smaller systems, you have to deal with smaller ones. Why you need smaller ones? Again, this has to do with the reserve requirements. It's pretty logic that if you have a demand of 100 megawatts, you probably won't dispatch a power plant of 100 megawatts. If you lose that power plant, you're lost. So it doesn't really make sense to have big plants in small systems. And then, of course, the isolated character makes or gives additional costs due to the logistics. So you have to transport the fuel. If you use renewables or local renewables, you cannot meet that cost. So there's already a hint to why it makes sense to use renewables in island systems. Technical differences, again, is related. Well, in small systems, every generator represents a significant amount of the whole demand. If you go to a large system, I know very well the European one, the Spanish one unit is an insignificant amount of the whole demand. It doesn't really matter if you lose it. Well, you will notice it in the frequency, of course. In an island system, one generator can be 10–15% of the demand. If you lose it, you will see it. You will feel it. So you will have large deficits in power generation. Usually the number of units is very small. This implies that the inertia is usually very small. And well, this brings a lot of problems in terms of stability. And then we have another problem, that's just the geographic size. Well, you can, of course, install renewables, and it's very much pushed forwards, not only by governments, even by cost calculation, it makes sense. But the problem is islands are small. Some areas you cannot build farms, for example, so you have to concentrate them in certain areas. So when you have all your intermittent power source at one place, you cannot count on what we call the portfolio effect. So if the wind goes down, your power output, there's nothing else that can balance this. In larger system like in Spain, if you have less wind in the north, maybe you have more sun in the south. So you have a balance, a statistical balance, of course. These you don't have on island system. So you can count on portfolio effects. That's somehow illustrated for the island of Gran Canaria on the bottom, where you see that just the whole wind farms are in the south of the island, at just one spot, basically. So these characteristics bring some challenges for island power systems. Challenges on operation costs, this has to do with they're basically higher due to the lack of economy of scale and the transport, and because of the large reserve requirements. And then you have challenges with respect to stability. Basically, frequency stability, we will see some examples of others, of transient stability. But the big issue in stability and frequency stability is that the lack of inertia and the slower reserve responses. The more wind you put in, the slower will be the response. Some of the challenges renewables might solve, like costs, you can bring them down. Others of these challenges will be accentuated by renewables, so you make them worse. We will see how you could face some of these. Well, the dominant role, the connection between those technical and economic challenges is actually the reserve, the spinning reserve. So the requirement in most islands, it's very similar in all of them, is that the reserve must cover the largest expected power variation. We'll see what this actually means. But you will reserve power to foresee variations. This reserve is then assigned to all units through marginal costs. So you try to reserve, to assign the reserve in the most economic way and in function of technical characteristics. It's obviously it doesn't make sense at all to put all your reserve to a very cheap unit when this unit is very slow, because you don't have effectively any reserve. It won't act ever. So you have to take into account both of it. So spinning reserves will then affect stability, so how you distribute the reserve among the groups, and it will affect the economic operation, because you have to have spinning reserves available, so you will lose part of your cheapest capacity. So let's start with the economic operation. How do Spanish islands work? So basically there's no market, and they are all operated under a centralized scheme. That means that basically you have a dispatch. You have a unit commitment which programs the units, their startups and shutdowns according to some dispatch rules, which is actually an optimization problem, which takes into account security of supply criteria. And this is not only done once, but this is done in several time steps. So you do a pre-planning, let's say, on a weekly basis, where you try to schedule the startups and shutdowns. Then every day you will, let's say, update the set points of the generating units, and even in the between days or in the intraday or in real time, you will adjust again these set points. So it's not done once, it's done several times, just to take into account variability of your different other sources, be it wind, be it load. Load, the variability is more known, wind or solar, less known. It's very difficult to predict. What you try to do in the economic operation is reduce the costs. Of course, you want to have the cheapest operation possible, satisfying demand and the technical constraints of the units, and of the reserve itself. The renewables, they can affect, or they can have a positive impact, of course, in this whole dispatch. Which one? Well, at the lower scales of renewables, if you reduce the net demand, the demand that conventional generators see, well, you need less conventional generators. That makes it cheaper. So that's pretty straightforward. But the renewables might also affect the reserve requirements and even the ramping capacity. So if you have a very large amount of renewables and you have quite a large variability in wind, well, the remaining units or devices you have, they must be able to follow that up and down of the wind. Otherwise, you will get into problems. So what are these reserve requirements I always talk about? Well, there is one for the up reserve, there is one for the down reserve. What's the up reserve? Well, basically you have to cover the outage of the largest unit, or the demand increase, or the loss of an interconnection if you have island interconnected, or the most probable renewable variation, whatever that might be. They do not, usually at least the system operators in Spain, they do not really identify what's this most probable renewable variation. It's a loss of a wind farm, it's only the expected forecast error, I guess not. Whatever it is, it's not very clear. I think this is a point where we can or should discuss hours and hours on what should be actually done here without being or asking too much. And then the down reserve is very easy, just half of the up reserve. They decided it that way. We can discuss this as well. So let's start with numbers. So that's, let's say, the framework, how it works. Now, what happens in islands, on Spanish islands, when you put in wind? So we did a recent study on wind integration in Tenerife. That's one of the bigger islands. We contemplated actually 3 scenarios. Why 3 scenarios? Well, actually, it was a tender for wind power integration, but you never know if the tendered amount is actually installed, because some companies will say, well, I'm actually not able to install the amount I offered. So we played with some scenarios. That's why we have here 3 scenarios of installed wind power. PV is not further increased. And we see what happens with regard to spillage. If there is more wind spillage, less wind spillage, or the same as before. Here an important message is the following. Well, if the wind power is operated as now, that's on the right side, we'll see that. On the right side figure, you see the spillage of wind power according to these 3 scenarios. Once the wind giving reserve, down reserve, and once without providing down reserve. So what you see is that with the blue bars, when the wind doesn't do anything, it's just injecting whatever it can and do not provide down reserve, you will have a lot of spillage. The more wind you install, the more spillage you will have. Why is that? Well, that's what we see on the graph on the left. What you see there is you have in yellow the down reserve requirement, which is actually computed during the dispatch. Then in gray, the down reserve that can be provided by the units. Here is only the synchronous units. And in orange, the spillage of wind power. And what you see is whenever the gray curve and the yellow curve touch, you have spillage. Basically, that means the problem is this down reserve requirement, or that wind power does not provide down reserve. So we changed this and said, okay, wind power gives down reserve. What happens? Again, on the right side, you will see the spillage. This time you have to focus on the orange plots, and you see it clearly reduces. So this is one thing we mentioned in discussions with the market agents, and actually the system operator is now considering this. So wind power gives reserve, down reserve. Up reserve is another question, but down reserve is essential. In general terms, what we have seen for Tenerife, we did this for a lot of islands. Of course, not for all of them. So what we used here is, let's say, a representative approach. You can have a lot of initiative or action that are able to reduce operation costs. So we have seen the one with renewables. Of course, you can put in storage. You can make use of the responsiveness, the flexibility of the demand, the flexibility of electric vehicles. And so we analyzed for a couple of islands what is actually a good mix of actions to make them a bit more sustainable, means a bit less dependent on fuel. So what we did is, instead of analyzing the 60 islands where we have data about it, we just clustered these islands. So we took them, we identified indicators of all these islands, applied a clustering algorithm, and got 5, let's say, representative islands. And we played with these islands. So these islands are different in costs, in demand, in the voltage, the high voltage level of the transmission grid. So we have clustered them, and we got 5 of them. And we just wondered what happens if you play with these different actions. So we increase the wind, we increase PV, we have storage, we have demand-side response, we have EVs. And what you get is, I will only comment some of these results here. What you actually get, at least in terms of renewables, is that, of course, the more renewables you have, the less it costs. But you have a maximum of this reduction. If you go on installing, you will increase again the operation costs. So why is that? Basically, it's because of the reserve requirements. What happens? Well, if you have a lot of wind, and with the reserve requirement we implemented, well, you get at a point where when you put in more wind or more renewables in general, you reduce system operation costs, and you take out synchronous generators of the dispatch. But you will also modify the reserve requirements, and after a certain point, the most restrictive reserve requirement is not the largest unit anymore, it's the renewable variation. So if you go on and go on installing, you will have to reserve or put in again synchronous units to provide the extra reserve. And if you put in more synchronous units, you will have again an increase in the costs. So there is a clear maximum. Here in that case, I'm not sure again what island it actually was, but if I follow this one, for the PVs, you should not install more than this. It's pointless. Or you do other things, you add more storage, more whatever you want. In terms of storage, this is just a particular study we made just to show why storage is so successful in island systems. I do not talk about others. Storage is so successful because the reserve requirements are so big, which makes that, or which translates into very high associated costs of reserves. So if you can reduce that part, the better for the system. And one way to give reserve is by means of storage. So if we add storage in the dispatch mechanisms, what we see is that we can actually take out units of the dispatch, and the storage device is giving the necessary reserve that the missing synchronous units are not giving anymore. So the changing number of dispatched units is what we can see on the graph on the left. On the right, sorry. We just see the number of units connected at each hour during a week when the battery is providing reserve, or load shifting and reserve. And you see that just you can reduce the amount of connected units, which is an indirect measure of reducing costs. This cost reduction we can see actually at the lower part in percentage at the lower part of the slide. So we see if we add a relatively large storage device, we can reduce costs up to 6%. In the year we did this study, we just had it was viable to install this unit. You had an internal rate of return of about 8–10%. We did this study again last year in another framework, and since battery costs they fell in the last years, we got rates of internal returns of 15–20%. So in island systems, batteries are profitable. The problem is, I will skip these two slides, the problem is regulation is not prepared for it. The example, Spanish island power systems. Who gives reserves according to the grid codes and economic regulation? Units that are dispatched. So if you're not dispatched, you don't provide reserve. Now batteries are not even considered as a dispatchable element. So they cannot be, from a regulatory point of view, used as a reserve source. This gives some problem. One solution is just to put this battery behind a conventional unit. Why is this a good solution? Well, because the unit already exists. It's registered it's in the register, which allows you to participate in the dispatch, so you don't have to change this. The same remuneration rules will apply, that's fair enough. So there is no big change, but still you would have to change a little bit the grid code, because the grid code still says only the dispatched units can provide reserve. So that's where we just arrived some weeks ago. This is quite new. We made a proposal, at least it's very much in a proposal stage, where we reformulated this requirement that actually not the dispatched units must be or can provide reserve, but every device which is available and which can give that reserve in certain amount of time. Of course, it's not a good solution that you have a unit which is offline, which takes 15 minutes to start up. We have to avoid that one. So we said, okay, it can be an available unit, but you have to respond in 10 seconds, or in 5 seconds, or in 3 seconds, whatever the regulator finally says. But you need a kind of quality, a deployment quality. You need to say, well, whatever element is there can participate, but in due time. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Okay, let's skip to the technical part. We've seen terms, let me check the mobile. We've seen the impact of reserves on the economic operation, what we can do with wind or renewables and storage. Now we want to see what happens with the technical part, which is basically the stability. I've prepared some slides on the transmission network capacity. I will skip them, because basically there we will see that even so, the substitution of conventional generation will reubicate the generation of the renewables. The flows through the branches might be different, but there's no big issues so far. It's no big issue because the grid in the island systems and the Spanish island system is pretty strong. So that's not a big issue. However, the stability part, this I would like to mention you. This is pretty interesting. Because the renewables, they will affect. Well, that's what everybody expects. We'll see it's not that straightforward. What everybody expects with renewables is that inertia will be reduced. Okay. What everybody expects is that when you have less synchronous units online, the speed of the reserve deployments will also reduce. So we have slower total or global responses of the generation system. So that's the thing we try to illustrate in this graphic where you see two frequency responses. In one you don't have renewables, and the other one you have renewables. And you see this typical expected behavior. You have steeper rate of change of frequency. The frequency falls more, and the response, the final error in steady state is larger. So that's what everybody expects. And usually, so far, in many islands, what the operators did is just say, well, I did this simulation, and it looks like that for 30% of the demand, your renewables do not pose any problems. Okay, after 30%, I feel that's dangerous, I cut it off. But that's maybe not the best idea. That's a way to be sure, but it's maybe not the way, the best way to do it. Could we do it? Maybe yes. Why? Well, because also it's true that renewables might reduce the inertia and reserve speed. It doesn't happen linearly, nor continuously. Why? Because that's a result of the dispatch. And the economic dispatch, or the unit commitment, that's a mixed integer linear programming problem. So it's mixed, it's not only linear, it's integer. So you have or you don't have. That makes it very much complicated. And maybe increased wind won't change a lot the dispatch status of the units. Furthermore, renewables might provide or emulate inertia and spinning reserve upwards. Well, the emulation part is somehow studied, even the reserve part, technically it has been studied. I'm just looking at it at the economic point of view, and so far it doesn't look really good for the renewables. So reserve and renewables, well, that's so far not contrasted, but it looks like it's not the best way. So let's see what happens technically. Let's go again back to this study in Tenerife. Let's focus just on the frequency stability, and let's compare it with the current situation. So I will skip, I'm sorry to do this, just to save some time. So these are very heavy graphics, so it takes some time. That's transient stability, we'll skip it as well. It doesn't seem to be a big problem. Let's have a look at the frequency part. So what we try to do is, with these different scenarios of wind penetrations we had in Tenerife, we wanted to see what happens with frequency stability. But there is one question: how do you evaluate it? So one way to evaluate is to look at load shedding. If you shed load, probably there was a problem. That's an indicator. Another way to look at it is just to look at the frequency deviation. So if frequency deviates a lot, there might be an issue with the active power balance. So it might be an indicator of problem as well. So we looked at those two indicators and wanted to see if actually what we expect, that everything is getting worse, if this is true. Well, let's have a look at the global parameters. So just on the left, sorry, the quality. On the left, you see for these three different scenarios, for each hour, the system inertia, the equivalent inertia. So I only ask you to have let's say, a benevolent look at it. But if you look at it, the blue one is with less renewables, red one is with most renewables. You would say, it looks like that inertia is reduced when you have more renewables. It looks like. And that's what also can be seen in the table below, because there I give the average numbers of the inertia, which goes down a little bit, but you have to take into account these are mean values. This value k, the gain, is the inverse of the droop, so it also goes down, means ooh, so the responsiveness is worse. But look at this, the amount of shed load in percentage of demand first increases and then decreases drastically from 27 to 20%. I did not do anything, no adjustment to load shedding, nothing. The question is, what's this? Why is that the case? Are others lying when they say everything is getting worse? No, but they forgot one thing, that when renewables are into the system, you change the dispatch. So what happened with the dispatch? Well, basically what happened here is, and you can see it in this right graphic where you see the dispatch of the combined cycle power plant, which is the largest unit of the system, for each hour. And when you went to larger penetrations, you had less power there. There was less power dispatched. And if you have less power dispatched, even if you have less inertia, and you have a look at these units, when you lose that units, if your amount is less, you lose less power. So if you lose less power, you are probably right to expect that the deviations in frequency will be smaller. And that's what you can see here. For each of these three scenarios, we simulated for all of the 168 hours, all possible outages of each unit once after the other, just to see how robust the system is. And you see that the frequency variations from the low renewables to the higher renewables, or to the medium renewables in the middle, increases a little bit. But then for the largest scenario, the highest scenario of wind power, they reduce. It's just the case that the dispatch changed and the units, the conventional units, produce less power. And if you lose less power, the thing is less worse. So it's not necessarily true that more renewables is less stable. We have to be careful. I agree with that in very large systems, where the dispatch is nearly not changed. So what can you do in any way to improve this? Well, one way to improve it is to use storage device. And again, we saw it on reserve. It's viable, it makes sense. We have also done several projects where you see it from the technical point of view, from the stability point of view. So in Spain, you have in La Palma, you have an ultracapacitor installed. And in La Gomera, which is also a rather smaller island, you have a flywheel installed. And now they want to install a battery, a lithium-ion battery in Menorca, which is on the Balearic Islands, and in El Hierro, which is one of these famous flagship projects. They want to move there a lithium-ion battery from Gran Canaria to El Hierro. Why? Well, in El Hierro, you have this famous pump storage unit and the renewable 3 wind generator associated to it. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that the hydro, the pump storage, they have let's say, a particular response to frequency deviation. Instead of, when the frequency goes down, increasing power, initially they reduce that power. That has to do with the inertia of the water column within the pump storage. So they want to bring the battery there to improve this system. So there are a couple of battery systems in place. We had measurements, we validated our models. It was very beautiful work. So I just want to give some few words on how we could size that battery. Well, if we are interested in, of course, in the frequency stability, we should somehow take into account the dynamics of the frequency. So what's the fundamental dynamic of the frequency? Well, it has to do with the rotor of the units and the turbine and turbine controls of the turbine itself, the speed regulation. Of course, if you have renewables, it would be equivalent to have the emulated inertia or the provided droop controls. So you can include this. And we developed a very simple but quite effective equation. I was surprised myself how effective it was when I applied it sometimes, to estimate the minimum frequency variation. Well, it's the variation of the frequency associated to its minimum, let's say the frequency nadir variation. And of course it depends on the lost amount of power, of the equivalent inertia of the system, of, let's say, of a time constant of your controls, and of your gains, or the inverse of your droops. And with this estimation, if you impose, for example, that frequency should not fall below 49 Hertz, where load shedding starts, you can estimate the amount of lost power the maximum amount of power you can lose. And then you can say, well, if this is the maximum amount of power I can lose, if I compare it with the maximum load, maximum power I lose from the dispatch, the difference of these two, the battery should provide, because the battery provides a nearly instantaneous response. So we applied this to the ultracapacitor. There we had also designed the energy, the amount of energy, which is another thing I won't show. And when you use an ultracapacitor, and again we simulated the 100 and something scenarios, different outages for different dispatches. When we use the ultracapacitor, which is, we reduce very much the amount of load which has been shed, which is shown in the table below. So basically we reduce it to 10% of the initial amount. That's a great result. In terms of frequency, the graphic on the left shows the frequency without ultracapacitor. On the right, you see what happens if you have this ultracapacitor. And there is this beautiful effect, which can be seen very well, that when frequency has arrived, well, it goes down through its minimum, it seems to fall again. What happens there? Well, the ultracapacitor, most of you know that in power it goes well, in energy it does badly. Well, this going down is just when we start to reduce the power output of the ultracapacitor. In the ultracapacitors, this needs a special control, which we call tail control. We reduce progressively the power output. Otherwise, you will have, again, kind of a generation outage. And just to finish, the last slide, we applied again this formula here to the Menorca system. And there is where I really started to believe in that formula. Well, I have still my doubts if it works always, but it worked 3 times. I estimated for 2 scenarios of dispatches the power capacity of the battery, which should be between 7 and 12 megawatts. When I then simulated with detailed models with PSSE, different battery sizes, I saw that it should be actually somehow around 8 and 14, or 12 and 14. So with my simple equations, which takes me 30 seconds to compute something, I have a very nice first shot on the amount of power. Well, what you see basically is, of course, you need some amount of power to avoid load shedding, and this again depends on the scenario which you consider. So again, only considering one scenario for the design is not the most robust way. Again, you have to consider various things. So just to wrap up, island systems are very particular. They have very particular challenges with respect to operation, cost, and stability. And let's say the nexus between stability and operation is the reserve. So renewables, they are beneficial for the systems because at, let's say, medium or nearly high values, they can reduce operation costs. But then, after a certain level, this is not effective anymore. There you should need more action. So you could add battery systems. Now, take into account, it's a good measure to reduce operation costs, but at one point you should check your viability. So you can, of course, install a lot of nice things, but what we have seen is that the internal rate of return of all this installation is just negative. It doesn't make sense. So it can turn out that the best thing is to install renewables and do not anything else. It's not worthy now. Maybe tomorrow in 10 years, this is a different thing. So storage might be a good alternative. It seems to be viable in island systems, to be considered in the future. And with respect to the stability, what I can say is up to certain levels of renewables, it seems that increasing renewables does not necessarily lead to a less stable system. So I didn't show you the impact on transient stability, but it did not improve. Actually, that makes somehow sense. If I go to the extreme, if there are no synchronous machines in the system, what's the problem with transient stability? Transient stability has to do with synchronous machines. If there are no problem anymore. Other stability problems might arise, but transient stability not. In any case, if you have advanced devices here, storage, they of course can provide you or give you support. But again, it's a question of profitability and viability.